It is week 14, and guess who managed to forget his webcam and leave it at the office again instead of taking it with him home while he planned to record on Good Friday evening? Yep, that's right. So, yeah, you will be deprived of my face once again, and I am sorry about that. I am really off my game here toward the end of our semester. Oh well. We are going to dive into modern art as it emerges at the dawn of the 20th century, the first initial decades of the 20th century. So let's talk about brought about 20th century modernism. Well, you're going to hear about existentialism from Professor McIntosh, but the existential philosophy really was developed in the 19th century, but really begins to take hold and become mainstream, if you will, in the 20th century. The ideas of philosophers such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. The existential philosophy is that the universe and existence as a whole is chaotic, and that we can become truly free when we recognize that, and accept the fact that the universe is chaotic. The theories of Sigmund Freud, and more specifically his psychoanalysis, which dealt with such concepts as the fragmented mind, dream imagery, sexuality, appropriate childhood development, was very attractive to artists at this particular time. Also, at the end of the 19th century, Darwin's Origins of Species was published, and it outlined two ideas that fascinated artists at this time. The ideas that humans and all other life evolved from something more primitive and primordial. And so you're going to see a lot of artists at this time who start looking for what is that more primitive, primordial ideology or philosophy or whatever that we humans came from, because you're going to find a lot of artists who are wanting to find a universal art, an art that will speak to any human being on the face of the earth without it having to be explained to them, because it would connect to that primitive or more primordial nature that we all have inside of us. This was an idea of a lot of artists at the time. And the implication, though Darwin never actually stated it himself, that a creator deity may not exist. That was also an idea of existentialism. Now, Darwin never actually stated that himself, but a lot of people sort of infer, it's an implication, that comes from the idea that all life evolved from something more primitive and primordial before it. All of this really starts to come to a head at the beginning of the 20th century, and it becomes the background of the artwork that gets made at the time. So what else? There were two extremely bloody world wars that happened right at the beginning of the 20th century. That contributed to all of this, particularly the high-tech weaponry and... hang on, I didn't mean to jump ahead. Particularly the high-tech weaponry that was used to fight them, and the huge numbers of people that were killed in those wars. This further disillusioned those who had lived through them. Then there was the increased legitimacy of socialism in Russia, because it became the first communist nation. At the same time, there was the spread of fascist ideology. Fascist ideology is the idea that one charismatic leader should be the ultimate authority over a nation, and that nation should look very much inward toward pure and utter national pride, forgetting and caring nothing for those outside of it. Just understand that's where the idea of fascist ideology. There were a lot of dictators at the early 20th century who were ruling under or by fascist rule. Then the Great Depression hits at the beginning of the 20th century. Are you noticing a pattern? There's a lot of harsh stuff that happens at the beginning of the 20th century that makes human beings start to question whether or not there's order to the universe. Because a lot of horrible, bad things happen right at the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of death, a lot of the dictators and fascist rule, things of that nature. There's a lot of things that are making people question the nature of the universe at this particular time. There's this concept that begins at the beginning of the 20th century, this concept of what's called the alienated man. This is essentially the idea that all human beings are alienated from one another by social, political, psychological, and religious constructs. And that any human is essentially unknowable by any other human being. Right? This is a philosophy that sort of arrives at the beginning of the 20th century that says there are social and political, psychological, and religious constructs that we are all sort of forced to participate in and are therefore separated from one another as a result of. And that as a result, no one can ever truly know another person because there are all those filters in between, right? psychological, religious, all these things can separate us and put up filters that affect how we think about and view the other human being across from us. And as such, we never really truly can know that person in there. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, there are a lot of people who are starting to feel like they're alienated, right? That who I am and what I am is unknowable to the world at large. So, early 20th century modernism is following right on the heels of post-impressionism, right? And what's going to happen here at the beginning of the 20th century is the direct result of artists looking back at the post-impressionists and deciding to push what they were doing further. The first of these, and understand the 20th century is just full of these. We're going to get to as many of them as we can, as quickly as we can. There are a lot of these art movements that are called the isms, right? They often get referred to as the isms of the 20th century. Cubism being the first one that we're going to look at. Cubism was greatly, well, first off, we'll talk about the influences here. It was greatly influenced by the late work of Paul Cézanne and his abstract treatment of volume and space. The first pioneers of the movement were Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. I know it's like Georges, but it's Georges Braque, who decided to portray the way that modern human beings saw the world around them by depicting objects from multiple viewpoints using intersecting planes. Right, so you can sort of see then how that's coming out of the work of Paul Cézanne, right, and his way of sort of trying to create an image that has multiple viewpoints, multiple perspectives within it. They just take it further by applying a structure to it. I forgot to put up the intersecting planes, my bad. They limited color in order to emphasize the importance of structure and line. Like this image that you can see over here to the right. Right? That's pretty much a brown image. I mean, they didn't want too many colors coming in there and mucking up the underlying structure and the line and the planes. Out of this, there are two types of cubism that developed, both of which were pioneered by, again, Picasso and Braque. There's analytic cubism, where the depicted objects are broken up, analyzed, reassembled in an abstract form, particularly in paint. And synthetic cubism, where a completely flattened space is achieved through the use of collage and appropriated objects. Remember that term appropriation from the last series of lectures that I gave you. So Pablo Picasso, born in 1881 and died in, wow, that should say 1973. But anyway, he's a 20th century Spanish painter, sculptor, printmaker, ceramicist, stage designer, poet, playwright. This guy did so much stuff. And I can't believe for a second that you don't know his name. Picasso is one of those names that's just synonymous with art, the same way that Vincent van Gogh, his name is synonymous. He spent most of his life in France, right, which is how he ends up grabbing onto the ideas of the post-impressionists. And he was, along with Braque, a founding member of the Cubism movement. And the painting that gets the credit for being the first Cubist painting, although it's not perfect, it's not quite there yet. This is where he's just beginning to experiment with the ideas. Is this painting, Demoiselles d'Avignon, the Ladies of Avignon, that he painted in 1907. Now, despite what the movie Titanic would have you think, this painting was not on the Titanic. It did not sink to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. This painting is still in existence, and this, again, is Pablo Picasso starting to play around with some of what really truly would become Cubism. Now, he hasn't limited his color palette yet, right? There's some blues and some reds and some yellows, and he's got a wider palette here. But he is starting to experiment with some of the ideas he got from Cézanne's work of giving us multiple viewpoints within the image, right? The women aren't just portrayed in a Renaissance sense of space, right? These women, in some areas, look very flattened. In other areas, they look maybe three-dimensional, but they don't look correct to the proportions or the perspective, right? And we've got some areas where there are sort of like intersecting planes within the image as well. Also, Picasso was trying to, at this particular moment in time, trying to find artistic styles that were not, which he felt were not mired down in the Western way of thinking about art, right? In the late 19th century in France, those artists were doing the same thing in that they were looking at Japan. And they were, wow, Japan is not hung up on all of the crazy stuff that we are hung up on since the Renaissance over here in the West. Let's adopt some of their ideas. For Pablo Picasso, where he decides to look is Africa. Now, this is something that in the 21st century we look back on with a little bit and see it as a bit problematic, right? Because it's kind of what's referred to as cultural appropriation. To a certain extent, what the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were doing when it came to Japanism, that was a little bit of cultural appropriation as well. But in the case of Picasso, a lot of it's coming from what we talked about a moment ago, the idea and the thought that all human beings evolved from something more primitive. And so Picasso's thinking, well, if I want to make an art that's going to connect to everyone, then I need to look for the art that is closest to the most primitive. And I should incorporate that into my work. So there's a respect for the art of different tribes in Africa in what we see in Picasso's work here. But there's also a lack of understanding about it because, again, he is looking at the art of the people of the continent of Africa as being more primitive. he would say closer to that primordial source that he wants to get to, but still, there's this thing of sort of saying that the artwork of Europe has become too advanced, and so we need to look back at more primitive sources of art. You can see why we look back at it now, we sort of see it as being problematic. Basically, he wanted to look for imagery and approaches to art that were very different from the Western way of thinking about art, and trying to incorporate that. And so you see in a couple of these figures, like this woman's face here and this one here, you see these faces looking not unlike tribal masks from the continent of Africa. As well as you can see this woman here, her face, and to a certain extent her stance, referring back to ancient Egypt as well. Then he and Georges Braque find one another, they become fast friends, and they start working on this new style, which eventually they call Cubism. And as I mentioned, it splits into two types: analytic Cubism. Analytic Cubism is pulling very much from the ideas and work of Cézanne. This particular painting, a portrait of Ambroise Voillard from 1910, where Picasso, in this particular case, is constructing his composition by looking at his subject, in this case, Ambroise Voillard, that would be the gentleman that is in this painting, but not just drawing him or painting him from one perspective. Right? He's like, I'm a modern human being, and people in the modern world see the world differently. Right? I'm a modern human being. I can get up, I can move around. Life is faster and quicker now than it's ever been. There's no reason for me to sit and just look at this from one perspective. Why can't I have multiple perspectives? And so, with using intersecting planes, right, you can sort of see that the planes are defined. They're sort of rectangular, sometimes triangular, but they're very hard-edged planes that sort of intersect with one another. And within each one of those planes, he will be painting his subject, again in this case a portrait, from a different angle. So maybe I look at my subject from sitting directly in front of him, and then maybe next I'll move over here to his right, and maybe I'll stand slightly above him. And then maybe I'll move over here and look and get down on the floor and look up at him. And I'm going to make all these different intersecting perspectives combine together, overlap one another, intersect with one another, right, to create this image that is less about the subject matter itself and is more about the structure of the painting. Then there's synthetic cubism. This is also an innovation of Picasso and Braque. And this piece here, Guitar with Wine Glass, is an example. This is from 1912. Synthetic cubism wants to depict objects, but to do so in such a way that complete and utter flatness is achieved, that there is no sense of any kind of three-dimensional space. That's done very intentionally. The story goes that Georges Braque was the first one to start this off when he got, you'll see, like, Picasso has a little bit of it in his as well, but Braque got this bit of faux wood grain that had like a glue backing on it, and he used it in an image that he was making to lay down an area that he wanted to be the table onto which he was going to put some other stuff. And it resulted in this image that was just pure cut and pasted paper. Picasso liked that, and Picasso, understand, he didn't just steal from the continent of Africa. He wasn't above stealing from his friends as well. And so he was like, hey, can I have a piece of that faux wood grain as well? And here he is making an image of a guitar, some sheet music, a bit of newspaper, and a wine glass on a tablecloth, all of which is created through cut and pasted paper, and results in this completely and utterly flat image that is not trying to create an illusion of three-dimensional depth whatsoever. Georges Braque, again, at this time, he's a French painter. He's the other founding member of Cubism. And during the Cubist years, the work of Braque and Picasso were nearly indistinguishable from one another. Right? In fact, a lot of art historians have had to try to really work to figure out which paintings were whose at the time. Sadly, Braque gets overshadowed by Picasso because Picasso was such a bombastic personality, and Braque was quieter, more reserved, and sadly doesn't get quite the same amount of credit. This is a painting of his, the Portugais, from 1911, which is underneath all of this that we can see here is a musician who is playing a stringed instrument of some sort, a guitar or something, in a cafe that was called the Portugais in France. And again, he's approaching this in the same way as Picasso. A limited color palette, just browns, whites, and blacks and grays, right? These intersecting planes, these very sharp-edged planes, and within each plane, he would have been looking at his subject from a different viewpoint and combining all these viewpoints into one image that defies the sense of Renaissance space that the Western art world has been so obsessed with for, at this point, it would have been 400 years. Over 400 years, honestly. The next ism that we'll speak about that arrived at the beginning of the 20th century is Fauvism. And Fauvism was greatly influenced by Impressionism and Van Gogh's treatment of color. The Fauves, as they were called, were led by Henri Matisse. They explored free expressive use of color. In Fauvism, color is the primary concern in painting. with people and objects being abstractly represented. The people and the objects within the painting are less important than the color itself. The Fauvists believed that color could be independent of subject matter, right? And they were called the Fauves for similar reasons to the Impressionists. It was at first a term of derision. There were critics who saw their work in galleries and referred to them as Fauves, which translated means wild beasts. These wild beasts who don't know how to paint, right? Who are just throwing crazy colors onto the canvas and trying to call it art, right? That was a criticism that was hurled at them, and just like the Impressionists, they decided to embrace it. And by calling themselves the Fauves, they essentially were calling themselves the wild beasts. Again, the leader of this group is Henri Matisse, and he is, alongside Picasso, considered highly influential on the burgeoning 20th century modernism, right? Early 20th century modernism is pretty much going to kind of branch out from Picasso and Matisse. Braque should be included in there, but sadly his name doesn't get put out there quite as much as Picasso's. And when we talk about the Fauves being obsessed with color, there's no greater painting, I would say, to look at than Henri Matisse's Red Studio from 1911. Right? This painting of Matisse's studio certainly has objects within it, depicted objects that we can point to, and we can say, sure, there's a chair, right? All right, there's a chair, there's a clock over here, there's some stools, there's what looks like maybe a dresser. Oop, my hand hit the button. There's a painting hanging over here, there appears to be a table or maybe a desk, right? But those objects are represented very abstractly, right? When it comes to that clock and that dresser, we don't even get the depth of them. They just look like flattened, scrawled in marks. This table, the perspective, is off in about 4 different directions, right? That perspective doesn't fit traditional Renaissance perspective at all. That's kind of the theme of the entire painting. The entire painting feels very flat. Maybe we get a sense that there's a floor that's moving away from us in space, right? But if the floor is moving away from us here and then ends there, then we should be seeing a corner right here. We don't see that corner. He's depriving us of that. And why? Well, because this painting, its first and foremost subject is not the studio itself. This is not necessarily a painting of the studio, at least not as its most important subject. It is a painting of red, right? The painting is most concerned with presenting us with the color red, the emotional nature of red, the way red sort of jumps out and attacks our eyes, contrasting it with other colors that complement red well, like the greens and the blues that we see in some of these places. It's a painting of red, and the actual studio and the furniture and the objects that are depicted within it are a secondary concern to the main color, red. Another group that pops up at this time is German Expressionism. German Expressionism was highly influenced by Van Gogh and Gauguin's desire to express emotions and spirituality through expressive brushstroke, abstraction, and color. Right? You'll remember that. Right? The Fauves were really interested in the color aspect of what Van Gogh and Gauguin were doing. The German Expressionists were very interested in the emotional impact of what they were doing. Expressionism, it expressed a skepticism toward modernity, and it sort of emerged as 2 types. One was Expressionism that expressed the artist's anguish and tortured emotions when faced with modernity. And the second being Expressionism that is passionately spiritual in nature when confronted with modernity, which they saw as being very unspiritual. So there's two types of German Expressionism. One that is looking at the modern world and feeling extreme anxiety when confronted with it, scared of what the modern world is becoming, feeling reluctant to go into this world, but then also at the same time ever so slightly fascinated with it. And then there's the Expressionism that is passionately spiritual as a way of trying to find something that they see as missing in the modern world. Representative of the first of these 2 types would be Ernst Ludwig Kirchner in this particular painting of his, Street, Dresden. Kirchner is a German expressionist and a founder of the movement that was called The Bridge, which was an early expressionist collective. And his work, like I was just talking about a moment ago, expresses both a fascination with and a skepticism toward modern life. And his paintings are meant to give us this emotional uneasiness, right? Like, this is a simple street scene of just people walking on a street in Dresden. That's Dresden, Germany, not Dresden, Tennessee. But look at his way of painting it. The wild brushstrokes that he uses. The extreme colors that don't necessarily seem to be beholden to the actual colors of the things as they would appear in real life, right? The sidewalk isn't pink in Dresden, right? These weird kind of saturated blues and yellows and greens and oranges that are in the faces of human beings, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But again, it's meant to give us this uneasiness, right? He's fascinated with modern life, but at the same time, he looks at, in this case, a street that's just absolutely packed with people. Of course, to us, this wouldn't look so packed with people. We're kind of accustomed to large crowds. Like, surely you've been to plenty of outdoor concerts and things of that nature that have a larger packed audience than this crowd here. But for Kirchner in 1908, this was getting ridiculous in his mind. And look, the people who are approaching us, look at their faces. Their faces have turned into sort of horror, masks of horror, creatures, not human beings that are approaching us. On top of that, you may notice that most of the people who are approaching us are women. And understand the old Victorian era ideas of how women should remain in the home and should only go out with an escort were starting to be stripped away. And there were many men at this time, and many of the abstract expressionists were amongst them, who saw that as scary and threatening. I know it seems silly to us now, perhaps. But at this particular moment in time, that was a scary idea, the idea that women were gaining power. And so it's significant that the two main figures that we can see that are approaching us are women, unaccompanied women, and their faces are green, orange, dead, black, lifeless eyes. The hand of this one woman is a claw, and she sort of moves toward us in this spooky fashion, right? It's emotion. He is anxious and skeptical, while at the same time fascinated with modern life, and his painting is meant to make us feel the same way. Wassily Kandinsky, on the other hand, in this painting called Composition 7, is not just the opposite, but is at least expressing his skepticism toward modern life in a spiritual manner. He was a Russian painter and art theorist that is recognized, and this is an important enough thing that if I were in your shoes, I would write it down and make a note of it. He is recognized as the first purely abstract Western artist. Abstract, in this case, really meaning non-representational, meaning that when you look at it, there's nothing you can point at and say, oh yeah, there's a dog, there's a house, there's a foot, whatever, right? It's pure abstraction. And art history recognizes him as the first in Western art history. However, again, remember, it's the beginning of the 20th century. Socialism has taken over in Russia, and his work was considered out of step with that Soviet government, so he left for Germany and became a big leader of the Expressionist movement. And his work was meant to be spiritual in nature. What he was trying to do was paint what is spiritually primordial in each of us. What he had hoped to do was to create a universal art. You're going to hear that said a lot in the 20th century. He wants a universal art. He wants something that anybody will look at and be able to recognize and understand. And he felt that the way of doing that was to reach back and find that part of you that was connected to spiritual things. That doesn't necessarily mean God, certainly the Christian God, or Jesus, or even any other religion, Buddha, anything like that. But he would say there's something spiritual within each of us that modern day life has pulled us away from. We're moving toward automation. We're moving toward the machine. We're moving toward living compact on top of one another. Right? The same kind of stuff that Kirchner was looking at and being worried about. But Kandinsky's going to say the way that we balance that or get away from it or what have you is to look inward and look toward the spiritual. And how can you paint the spiritual using the same approaches and the same techniques that have always been used to paint the physical world? Instead, the spiritual is going to have to be color, it's going to have to be mark, it's going to have to be movement, and not anything concrete, identifiable as something that exists in the real world that we can look at, right? Because if you brought in something like a horse or a basketball, I don't know what, anything that you could actually point to and recognize as something in the real world, then it's no longer spiritual. And I said at this particular time that Kirchner and other German expressionists were a little bit frightened by women at this time. Well, because right at this particular moment in time, women were standing up, fighting for freedoms, and gaining access to the public sphere. And this concept developed at the time of the new woman. The new woman is a woman who is liberated, who does not feel that she must be confined to the domestic sphere. She's going out into the public. She's working for a living. She's going out and fighting for the right to vote. Things of that nature. So let's look at a couple of artists who showcase that mentality. There's Frances Benjamin Johnston, born 1864 and died in 1952. She emerges as a photographer at this here at the turn of the 20th century, and her photography is it's mostly portraiture, and is meant to be expressive of this idea of the new woman. This here is a self-portrait as the new woman. You can see here was actually done in 1896, but she has she has photographed herself in a way that, again, to our 21st century eyes, doesn't seem so strange. But she's doing all sorts of things that were considered unladylike. She is smoking a cigarette. That would have been considered unladylike. That's something that the men folks should do, not the women. She's sitting with her legs crossed in such a way that a man should only be sitting like that. And in doing so, her petticoats have pulled up where you can see a little bit up her skirt. Oh, shameful. On top of that, she's got a beer stein in her hand. She's drinking a burr. Right? She is being a manly man, if you will. At least the 1896 idea of what a man would be. And it seems to be no accident at all that she has on the mantle a whole bunch of images of men who would represent the patriarchal society that she lives in, right? But she seems to just very quietly, and not with a lot of pomp and circumstance, if you will, fighting back through sort of a civil disobedience, if you will. I'm just going to act and act like and do a few of the things that are supposedly only in the realm of men, right? That I'm not causing any harm. I'm not causing any harm except for maybe to my lungs by smoking a cigarette. I'm not causing any harm by drinking this beer. I'm not causing any harm by crossing my legs in this way. I'm not causing any harm by sitting in this way that I am. But just in these small little things that I'm doing, I'm making a huge statement. And interestingly, she did a series of photographs. There are lots of these that she did of herself and friends cross-dressing. Right? And this is her here dressed as a man. There's another woman friend of hers dressed as a man up there, and here a man dressed as a woman. And they would make these portraits, not unlike this one, that were meant to just look like simple family portraits, right? Where nothing on the surface looks to be amiss. It's only when we look closer and realize, oh, well, these are cross-dressing individuals. And in 1890, when this photograph was taken, that was revolutionary, right? Bring into this as well Futurism then. Futurism is an Italian art movement that was spearheaded by fascist-minded artists and was launched with the publication of what was called the Futurist Manifesto in 1909. The manifesto called for a rebirth of Italy, which the author felt was mired in the classical past, which was no longer relevant to the modern world. Instead, according to the manifesto, artists should embrace modernity, electricity, automobiles, and machines, and they should put away the subject matter and styles of the past. Because they said, this is the new world we live in. It's automated. There are machines, there's electricity, there are cars, and there are trains, and things of that nature, right? That's what art should be about now. We should put away everything that came before it. It was inspired by Cubism, adopting the multiple viewpoints, intersecting planes, and the emphasis on structure and line of Picasso and Baroque. But it celebrated speed, motion, and the machine. Because the futurists believed that they had created an art that should replace all other art that came before it. They were very fascist in that way. Some futurists even called for the literal destruction of all art that had come before the 20th century. They thought that all of it was mired down in the past, and the past was corrupt. So we get paintings like this. This is Umberto Boccioni's States of Mind 1 farewells. They were so full of themselves, the futurists. They often give very bombastic titles to their paintings. They're so full of themselves. And you can see, again, the structure, the multiple intersecting viewpoints of Cubism, but the subject matter, as you can see, is a train passing by through a landscape filled with electrical towers and things of that nature. Steam, grit, coal, electricity, lights, right? All that kind of thing. Here's Giacomo Balla, I'm not sure. Abstract Speed, the car has passed. From 1913. I love the futurists. They were some assholes for sure. Again, like they were fascist as hell, and again believed that all art that came before them should be destroyed because it was mired in the past. And they felt, but the idea that this is what should replace it, right? A cubist inspired painting of a convertible driving past. That's what this is, right? That's interesting. It does give us the indication of sort of the speed and the motion with which it drove past. There are lines that sort of indicate sound waves, the sound of a car going by, that effect. That's contained within this painting. That's certainly interesting. But the idea that essentially that the futurists fan art of trains and cars and things like that should replace everything that came before it, it amuses me to a certain extent. But understand, let me go back real quick. Understand, this is right before World War II, right before World War I and World War II, where fascist dictatorship ideology of that nature was becoming in vogue. Also at this time, along comes a little art movement known as Dada. The movement began in France, but soon spread throughout all of Europe. It was a protest movement against the horrors of World War I. Dada emphasized the nonsensical and sought to break from what they considered to be old, corrupt traditions. It's said that the name Dada was chosen at random by shuffling through pages of a French dictionary and throwing a pencil into it, and that the word that the pencil landed on is what the artists were going to name their movement. I thought I had one more note on that. Dada literally translates to a hobby horse, and that's what they claim, at least. That one person flipped through this dictionary and another threw a pencil into it, and then it poked into the word Dada, which means hobby horse, and they figure that's perfect because the sound Dada is kind of nonsensical. It's also something that sounds like a baby might say, but it also is nonsensical because hobby horse seems to have nothing to do with the art that they're making. So the nonsensical, that is what Dada is all about. To point out just how nonsensical the world has become, and to point out how the world is governed by very old and by that nature corrupt constructs. So you get somebody like Marcel Duchamp here in his piece Fountain. This is a piece from a series that he called his ready-mades. Ready-made is one word. R-E-A-D-Y, ready, made, M-A-D-E, ready-mades. Ready-mades were artwork that was made by taking some pre-existing, usually commercially produced object and making some sort of change to it in order to say, now it is art. Right? And it was done in this very snarky, almost cynical way, right? Like Marcel Duchamp here is trying to question what it means, who gets to decide what is and is not art, and the nature of what can be considered art. So what has he done here? He has taken what is a urinal. No doubt about it. He has chosen something meant to be crass, right? He has chosen a urinal, a thing that we literally piss in, right? A thing that is not associated with sort of high society and art. A urinal, a mass-produced item on top of those things. And he says, here's how I can take that and make it art. I will take it, this pre-existing object, and I'll just change how it's presented, right? This is how you normally see a urinal. We normally see a urinal up on a wall in a very different orientation to this. And I will sign it. In this case, I'm going to make it a pseudonym, R. Mutt. Clearly chosen because it's a funny, stupid, dumb-sounding name. And date it, 1917. Bam! And now it is art. Because he is trying to democratize. There should not be, this is Duchamp's thinking, there should not be systems in place in society at large, in the government, in socio-political realms, that should be able to tell an artist what is and what is not art. Who should make that determination? The artist, him or herself, and only the artist, him or herself. Right? In his way of thinking, that'd be the only way to break free of the corruption of the past. Again, they were seeing, the Dada artists, the up close and personal, the horrors of World War I, and what they saw as the corrupt and nonsensical motivations of those who were pulling the strings and sending the soldiers to war. That the people who were suffering had no stake in the things that the wealthy, the elite, those who were in control of society and control of governments were fighting each other over. The people who were being sent out to die and the people living in the villages that were being overrun by war had no stake in that. And a lot of their work was meant to showcase that nonsensical nature and showcase just how corrupt they saw all that as being. They did so often through humor and often through, as in the case of this, methods that were not traditional methods of making art. Right? That urinal was certainly not a traditional way of making art. And this technique being used by Hannah Hulk here is what is referred to as photo montage, but it's also drawing direct inspiration from the synthetic cubism of Braque and Picasso, right? Cutting paper out of magazines, newspapers, photographs, and pasting them on to create an image that has no sense of true three-dimensional illusionistic space, and throwing together a series of images and words and things of that nature that are meant to showcase the nonsensical and the corrupt nature of the world in which they lived. Another ism that comes during this time is surrealism. And surrealism begins with the publication of the Surrealist Manifesto, which suggested that the arts, both visual, literary, and performing, should communicate dream imagery. Surrealism was highly influenced by Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, and specifically his ideas about the fractured mind, the conscious, the unconscious, and the subconscious. And he says the underlying subconscious is the thing that really motivates us, and the symbolic meaning of images within dreams. That the images that we see in our dreams have sort of universal symbolic meaning for all human beings. That was an idea of Freud's. Surrealism was an attempt, therefore, through art to make tangible the intangible subconscious mind. The Surrealists absolutely loved and adored Hieronymus Bosch and his wild, outlandish imagery full of symbolism and what they saw as being connected in many ways to the subconscious mind. Enter into that Salvador Dali, Spanish Surrealist artist, who painted bizarre, dreamlike imagery filled with symbolism. But he did that, interestingly enough, by combining it with a Renaissance master approach to painting. And so you'll get these paintings like this that look very naturalistic in many respects, but then also very dreamlike in others. This one, Persistence of Memory, the one that you all know, you've certainly seen or heard the terminology, the melting clocks. This was from 1931. This is dream imagery. And it would take me forever to sort of get into all the symbolism of everything that's going on here. What is he saying about the nature of time? What is he saying about having given it the title of Persistence of Memory? What is he saying about how our memories hold on to or don't hold on to things? We can get into all that. What I don't want to talk about is this weird, strange, like deflated, bloated, amoeba-esque looking thing here in this landscape that I've often heard lots of people like try to come up with weird suggestions as to what they thought that was, whether it was some sort of dying animal or whatever, right? It was a self-portrait. This was something he incorporated into a lot of his work, where he would take a self-portrait in profile, and he increasingly abstracted it, right? So that by the time we get to this Persistence of Memory, it is this completely deflated thing. But it was a self-portrait, right? Which suggests a lot about the personal nature of this work as well, and how a lot of this was sort of hung up in his own dreams and his own concerns about whether or not he was in control of his own actions and how he interacted with the world, and whether or not, a lot of his work is hung up on this kind of thing, whether or not his sexual proclivities were his own, or whether they had been forced upon him by outside forces, things of that nature. Well, then there's also Rene Magritte, who was a surrealist painter of the time, who often did these particular paintings of people with their heads covered in material, or there would be paintings of people standing with weird, strange, like floating apples and other fruit in front of their faces. And there's a lot of symbolism that, again, I could get into, but it would take much more time than I want to spend. I do, however, want to spend a little bit of time on this particular painting of his. It's probably one of his most well-known, The Treachery of Images, that he painted between 1928 and 29. This is a painting where Rene Magritte, he has painted a representational depiction of a pipe. It looks very naturalistic, right? And then below it, he has written in French, "This is not a pipe." Now, what can he possibly mean by that? Because we look at it, we're like, sure it is. Right there it is. Bam, it's a pipe. It's right there. Right? I see it. How can you say that's not a pipe? Well, there are a lot of ways that one can interpret this. The first of which being, if I look at that, no, that's not a pipe. That's not a pipe at all. That is paint on a canvas. And in fact, what you're looking at right now is actually your phone screen that is transmitting to your eyes the data that makes up a photograph that is one that someone took when they pointed a camera at the paint on the canvas, right? So it's not a pipe in that respect. So the treachery of images, the fact that an artist or photographer or whomever can give us on a flat surface color, value, line, what have you, pushed and shoved around in such a way that our brains can trick us into thinking that we're seeing a thing and list it as such. I can point at that and say that's a pipe. I don't say that's a painting that's made to represent a pipe, right? I say that's a pipe. That's the treachery of images, right? But can also be saying this, the word this is not a pipe, because it's not, the word this is not a pipe. So maybe he's playing around a little bit with the treachery of language. Is he saying the word pipe is not a pipe? Perhaps, right? The word pipe is not a pipe. Even the actual written word and the word you say out loud, pipe, is not an actual physical pipe, right? It's not the thing itself. The thing itself is the thing itself, and we need to have it in our hand to experience it. We have so many layers of separation from the actual real thing when we look at an image like this. Now, you may note that we haven't really talked much about American art during all of this, right? We've been staying fairly steadily in Europe. But at this point, art is starting to make some headway in the United States as well. And we'll look very, very quickly at that, specifically art that was made between the world wars. It's after World War II that American art really starts to take off. We'll look at art that explores American modernity, and we'll look very briefly at the Harlem Renaissance. American modernity. So around about this time, American artists are really hung up on a couple of things. One, I'm not going to have time for. One is something called regionalism. And these are painters who are mostly looking at rural America and are trying to capture the spirit of the grassroots American man or American woman or American community, and they do so by looking in the rural, regional areas of the United States. Others are very much looking to the cities, and they see that as the thing that is quintessentially American, the modernity of skyscrapers that are rising to the sky and things of that nature. And so you get artists like Joseph Stella, in this particular multi-paneled painting of his called The Voice of the City, New York Interpreted, where he is being very directly influenced by Cubism, Futurism, a lot of the isms that were influenced by Cubism that he has traveled and seen and is now bringing back to the United States, but using it as a means to interpret the modern cityscape that he sees as being sleek, unprecedented, nothing like it has come before. This is where we as Americans excel in the way that we have developed our modern electrically driven cities. And he's not the only one who's focusing on this kind of thing. There's this photographer, Margaret Burke White, who did these extremely modernist photographs of cityscapes, this one being the Chrysler Building that she photographed in 1931. That, again, it's a photograph, but look at how it's not at all that different from what the supremacists and the De Stijl artists were up to, right? It's just shape and line and form, right? It's pure composition. But like that is the spire at the very top of the Chrysler Building, that big gigantic skyscraper. Can you imagine what she had to do to get that image? Well, I'll tell you, Margaret Burke White was badass. And if you don't know much about her, I would suggest, if she's interested at all, that you go look up some stuff, because she was a badass. Look at that camera. She didn't have some silly little cell phone in her pocket for taking pictures. That's what she had used for a camera, that little heavy behemoth right there. And this woman would climb out, as you see here, out to the end of gargoyles on these big, gigantic skyscrapers to get these photographs from angles that nobody had gotten before. And then the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance happens in the early decades of the 20th century, where, and it's called the Harlem Renaissance because it really gets its start in Harlem, but this is a movement that spreads all around the United States. It was a call to African-American artists to return to their roots in the ancestral arts of Africa, which I put in quotations because it's exactly what was asked of them. So, in Harlem, New York, which had historically been a wealthy white neighborhood in New York City, as we get into the early 20th century, many of these wealthy white Americans were beginning to leave the neighborhood, just as there was a great migration of African Americans from southern states into more industrialized cities in the north. These individuals were moving to these large cities looking for work, and upon obtaining decent-paying industrial jobs, found themselves living lives they had been incapable of having lived in the South. And Now these very beautiful and large brownstone homes were empty and on the market in Harlem for prices much lower than they would have sold in the years before the flight of white citizens out of the neighborhood. These new middle-class African-American families were able to afford these homes, creating a huge demographic shift in Harlem. And the flourishing of those who lived in this area and the culture of fine arts, literature, and performing arts that springs up here marks the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, look at this photograph. This is 1932, right smack dab in the middle of the Great Depression. That's because Harlem continued to be a center of African-American wealth even well into the Great Depression. It actually took some time for the Depression to affect Harlem. And during the early 20th century, Harlem becomes this nexus of not only African-American wealth, but, as I just mentioned, of art, literature, and music, and this new flourishing of culture begins to spread throughout the United States. The Harlem Renaissance then takes place in cities all around the country. Here, locally, there were burgeoning Harlem Renaissances in St. Louis, and Memphis, and then even further south in New Orleans. It happened there as well. Jazz music emerges in Harlem in the early 20th century, and the Harlem Renaissance becomes known for an explosion of art that specifically aims to express the experience of being Black in America. And all of this was very intentional. The Harlem Renaissance was very influenced by intellectuals in the African-American community who rose to prominence at this time, among them W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke, who wrote these two treatises you see here, The Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois, and The New Negro by Locke. Now understand that the term Negro hadn't yet gained the negative connotation that it has now. At the time, it was just the term that was used to describe someone of black or brown skin in the United States at the time. Both of these books, amongst everything else that they said, claimed that African Americans should be doing everything in their power to uplift the race, because they live in a culture that does not see them as equals. So in order to be seen as equals by this culture in which they live, they need to do things that lifts them up, that showcases to those who are downtrodden, who are repressed, that the lives that they are currently living are not the lives they have to live. They can rise up, while also communicating to a larger white American society that this group of people that you look down upon is every bit as worthy of your respect as your fellow white Americans are. But the main thing was to communicate to other African Americans that they should rise up, that to be African American, to be Black, is to be proud, right? And that we are capable of great things. We need to lift ourselves up. And they both suggested that artists do so by looking to the ancestral arts of Africa. They're looking at artists like Pablo Picasso, who is stealing, they would say, the birthright of African Americans to make art that refers back to their African roots, right? Picasso, by incorporating those African masks and things of that nature. And so one of the things that particularly Du Bois and Locke point to is ancient Egypt. And they say, look, ancient Egypt is in Africa. That should be our legacy. We need to make art that, number one, aims to uplift the race, that is moral, that is here to showcase, again, to the wider African-American population, that we can uplift ourselves, we can be more in the society that we've been forced into, than we are currently, while also showcasing to the white sort of art establishment that the artists of the African-American community are just as worthy of being included in that establishment, while also using the heritage that they felt should rightly be theirs, like ancient Egyptian art. And nobody quite answered that call quite to the extent of this artist by the name of Aaron Douglas, born in 1899 and died in 1979. And he actually has a connection to Tennessee. In Nashville, there are some of his murals. His artwork around about this time, as he feels in his bones the calls of African American intellectuals at the time to make art that uplifts the race, and that looks back at, in his case, ancient Egypt, comes through in paintings like this, Aspiration from 1936, where he's combining some of the ideology that he's getting that's coming out of Europe when it comes to Cubism, right? That looks at like intersecting planes, but in his case, it's intersecting planes of color, and those intersecting planes of color have effects on one another, and then he creates these silhouetted figures that are both very modern, right? They look like human beings living in 1936 with their dress, whether they're dressed and things of that nature, but they also have that Egyptian quality to them in that they're silhouetted in a very Egyptian way. Their hard-edged, straight-edged shoulders harken back to this ancient Egyptian way of drawing people in their shoulders and their very boxy kind of nature, right? Like, that's all very Egyptian in nature. And then there will always be in Aaron Douglas's paintings a message of uplifting the race. So that we get, say, down here at the very bottom, we see several upraised arms that are shackled together in chains of people who are below the bottom of the painting, who we can't see. We're all reaching up in chains, right? And a series of individuals, all of which he has chosen to silhouette them in such a way as to make it apparent and obvious that they are African American. He doesn't want us to look at these people and think that they are white. He wants us to understand by their silhouettes they are African American. And how do these individuals up above suggest to those below that they will be able to lift themselves up? By education, right? Through music. This would be sort of like a saxophone or some sort of horned instrument this one's carrying. And this, education, science specifically, and literacy. And you need to go to the city, where there are factories that will provide jobs and the money that you need access to, as well as the literacy, the music, the education in the sciences. Lift yourself up. Lift the race up. We can do it together. There's even a lightning bolt pointing us in this direction. Everything is drawing us up to that city on the hill. All right, so that's where we will pause. That's all for the early 20th century. We'll get into mid and late 20th century modernism in the next lecture.